Good morning and welcome to the Point. It's been 3 weeks since we've been on the air. I hope you enjoyed the coverage of the Olympics. And in that 3 weeks, a lot has happened on the campaign trail. But we start this morning with the chairman of the Michigan Republican Party, Ronna Romney McDaniel. We go back to recap their big convention in Cleveland and talk about the race that's still ahead. Let's talk a little bit about convention. It seems like a long time ago. In fact, it has been a month, but we were on hiatus because of the Olympics. And now that we've all had a chance to get some sleep, tell me about that convention and how you thought it went, because on our way to Cleveland, people said, look out. There are going to be some really angry crowds. There could be a lot of stuff happening outside. We were in a safe zone of chain link fences that they drove us from one position to the other. And at the end of the day, not much of that materialized.
No, we've got to give kudos to Cleveland. They just did an outstanding job. Everywhere you went in Cleveland, people would say, thanks for coming to our city. And being from Michigan and being a neighbor, it was nice to see them do so well and to see that city shine. The convention was a success. We came out united behind our nominee. We went down as a Michigan delegation with 25 Trump, 17 Kasich, and 17 Cruz delegates. And for the most part, and I think everybody came around for Trump in the end. So that's good. We united our base. We're ready to go to November and win the White House.
You know, it's hard for people to understand because the party loyalists, the people who are really involved, the people who get elected as delegates to go to a national convention are very much true believers for their candidate. And so once you ask them then to pivot from somebody that, and it's not because it's Donald Trump, it could be any other candidate because that's not their candidate. It's tough to do. What do you say to people? How do you get them to come along?
You know, we just told them to vote their conscience. I mean, we didn't really push them to switch their vote. A lot of them said, you know, I want to vote for who my district supported in the primary, and I want to be true to that vote. But Kasich and Cruz were not up for nomination. Trump was. So our tally was very high for Trump. I think we had 51 for Trump in the end. And it's there. I mean, they know that he's the nominee. They know that if we don't unite, we're not going to win the White House. So it didn't take me convincing them. And really, Donald Trump did a good job. His team laid out a great case: make America safe again, make America work again, make America great again. They had great speakers. They talked about his vision for the White House, and that helped unify our base around him as well.
I will share this. I did in one of the stories I did from Cleveland. You told your delegation that, look, I know we're not all there yet, but the way to get there is not to get in somebody's face and tell them what they have to do, which was not always the tack taken by others. So the fact is that you really didn't try to twist arms too hard in Cleveland. And since then, do you think that's paid off for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think you win people to your side or have them at least listen to your message if you get in their face. What happens when you get in someone's face? They take a step back. But if you hold out a hand and you talk about the things that you have in common, you're far more likely to bring them over to your side, or at least listen to your message and why you believe so strongly that Donald Trump should be the president and why his policies are best to lead our country. And that's worked with our grassroots and our delegation, and it's working across Michigan as he's come to our state. And we continue to reach that hand out to bring people over and listen to our message.
Notably, Donald Trump has been in the state twice since he's received the nomination. I should point out that all the principals have been in the state at least once, which means that Michigan is on the radar. But before we move on to the state of the race, let's talk about that unity. This is what struck me, that there were a lot of people who wanted somebody else, and they said, you know what, this is our candidate and this is where we're going to go. So to that degree, you got the unity you were looking for. There are still a lot of big name Republicans that just aren't on board, and your convention was devoid of the last two Republican presidents, the last two Republican presidential nominees. That's a little unusual. Does that create a problem going forward?
No, I think it's been a grassroots up campaign from the beginning. That first event that Donald Trump had in Michigan at Birch Run, there were 3,500 people there. I had never seen anything like that for a candidate for president. It has been a base up nomination. We want those party leaders to come around. We need them still. But it takes time for others, and some of them were running for that very position. And it's hard when you're running for president and you lose in such a contested way. It may take a little longer to come around, but there are things that are at stake that are far more important, which are our Supreme Court, our national security, our health care, our economy, and jobs. Those are the things we should be talking about right now.
Well, in order to talk about those things, you've got to get past some of those swing states. We know what the ground game looks like in Michigan. But we also know one of the real pivotal states and a predictive state is Ohio. We know that Governor Kasich has been reticent to get on board there, and the numbers aren't great for Trump as we talk. And by the way, I should point out that we could do this on Saturday evening, and by Sunday morning, the numbers could have changed. But in general terms, in some of those big swing states, there is still some work to be done. Do you get a Kasich on board to help in someplace like Ohio?
I don't know if Governor Kasich's going to come on board, but the state party chair is on board, the Ohio party's on board, the grassroots is on board. Donald Trump's taking his case to the people of Ohio. He's bringing his case to the people of Michigan. And when he talks about jobs and the economy, and certainly what Midwestern governors have done in states like Michigan, in Michigan, we've added 460,000 new jobs. We're at 4.5% unemployment. Things are doing so much better in our state because of Republican leadership. Donald Trump, if he takes his message and says, this is what I'm going to do in Washington, I'm going to do what these Midwestern governors have done to turn your states around, that resonates in states like Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin.
I was at my first convention 40 years ago. I was a child, but I was still at my first convention 40 years ago, and I've watched presidential politics pretty closely. There have been some really interesting people who have come through those gates, but this may be the one that will be remembered for a very long time. How does Donald Trump and the campaign harness whatever is so unique about him and turn it into a mainstream message? Because now in the next 10 or plus weeks, you've got to appeal not just to the base, not just to Republicans, but to those other folks out there who may be saying, well, we're not sure about this. We got two candidates who both have above 50% in unfavorables.
Yeah, I think he's done a good job bringing his case to Michiganders, talking about things that matter to them, jobs, the economy, national security, but also he talks about being a change agent. We have sent politician after politician to Washington, D.C. and really haven't seen substantial results on major issues like Social Security, immigration, the tax code, so many issues, just nothing's getting tackled. And he's saying, you know what, take a chance on me. I'm different. I'm a businessman. I will bring change. I'm beholden to the voters, to the grassroots, to the middle class, to the people who don't have lobbyists and special interests in Washington, and I'm going to fight for you. And that's a message that resonates. It certainly won him the nomination, and I think as he expands into the general, that's a message that is resonating certainly across Michigan.
One of the things that Republicans at the national level talk about a lot is holding on to the Senate, and there are some really important Senate races, but we don't have one here in Michigan. So the down ballot races that I assume you're most concerned about are the state house races, where Republicans currently hold a pretty good, significant lead. If Donald Trump continues to come, and we don't know if he will or not, but if he continues to come to Michigan with this kind of frequency, does that help you overall turn out votes, you think?
Yeah, being competitive presidentially helps our down ballot. If you have a blowout, it affects all your down ballot all your down ballot races. So we want that candidate, our nominee, Donald Trump, in Michigan as much as possible. He has been here. Mitt Romney didn't come post-convention, neither did John McCain. Donald Trump has said to Michiganders, I am here for you. I'm going to come to your state. I'm going to fight for your vote. And we haven't had that in a long time. And I think that will help our down ballot races and help us keep majority in the state house.
When you look at what has to happen over the next 10 plus weeks, and when you look at what has to happen in terms of here in the state of Michigan, how is your ground game, not the Trump ground game, but the party's ground game? Because you have to obviously mobilize people, and again, you don't have a U.S. Senate race, you don't have a statewide ballot race in terms of a constitutional office, but you do have 110 seats, and of those there are, what, half a dozen that are, to maybe a dozen that are
16,
real competitive?
Yeah. So our ground game is great, but the first part of it is recruiting good candidates. We have a lot of open seats this year. Right now, the Republicans have 63 out of 110. We had to go look at those open seats and make sure we were recruiting good candidates. If you have a good candidate, that makes the race so much easier. And then we got through the primary, and now it's contacting our voters, finding our likely voters. We've been investing in neighborhoods and communities for the past year, working to knock doors and find out who our likely voters are. And now it's a turnout game. We've got to get them out to the polls. We've got to get them to vote absentee if they're not going to be here. And really, November, our election day, is going to depend on who does the best job turning out their voters for their candidates. And I feel really good about our ground game and what we've done to keep our majority in the House.
One of the things that I say every election cycle, and I always get an email that goes something like, duh. I said the election will depend on who turns out. Well, of course it depends on who turns out, but what I mean by that is identifying your voter, or for your counterpart, Brandon Dillon, identifying their voters and making sure they get out. Does the advent of somebody like Donald Trump, or even for the Democrats, Bernie Sanders, where you're bringing out people who may not have been engaged for a long time or maybe ever, does it make it harder to identify those people and to be able to motivate them to get all the way to the finish line? Because some people who aren't used to being in the political game don't always understand the importance of that final ballot, that final Tuesday after the first Monday in November.
Well, we've had to expand our universe with Donald Trump. He has reached out to voters that have not voted Republican in a long time, or voters who have sat on the sidelines. So we have had to identify those voters, expand our universe, and come up with a strategy on how to message to them. And you're right, get them to the polls on Election Day. And that is always the challenge. You know, when Mitt Romney ran against John McCain, a huge portion of the Republican Party didn't show up. They were not excited about President Obama, and they weren't excited about Mitt, and they were typical Republican voters, and they said, you know what, we're just going to sit home. We want to make sure that doesn't happen, not only for our state house candidates, but for our Supreme Court, our congressional candidates, and for Donald Trump for president.
Has the Republican Party been fundamentally changed going forward? Win or lose, Donald Trump is still going to be around in some form, because as it is now, this is a 5, 6, 7, 8 point race. Anything can happen between now and Election Day, and unless something dramatic happens, it looks like he has become a force within the party, whatever that party is now.
I think he's changed the rules of politics altogether. The way he ran his primary, to the free media he received. He didn't have the traditional ground games. He was able to reach out to the voters in very non-conventional ways, to throw these big rallies. He's changed everything. All the rules that have typically been used to win the nomination are now rewritten. And I don't know what that's going to mean.
There's a view from the Republican side. When we come back, you'll hear from a leading Democrat about their convention, about what their take is on the race. That's next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Senator Debbie Stabenow is the senior senator from Michigan and a leading Democrat who just recently returned from the Democratic convention in Philadelphia. We talked with her about the convention and the unity she thinks the party achieved while they were there. Let's talk about Philadelphia. We were both there. You had better seats than I did. But it was a convention, the first time for a long time that we've had them back to back.
Right.
It was a convention with a foregone conclusion, though there were still a number of passionate Bernie Sanders supporters that were there and made themselves heard in the delegation as well as on the floor. Give me the overall feel for you coming out of not your first time you've been to a convention, to be sure.
You know, I've been to a lot of conventions, Rick, and I have to say that I've never seen one better, both in terms of the way it was put together, the breadth and depth of America that was represented there. The fact that we started out the beginning of the week with people so passionate about Bernie Sanders as well as Hillary Clinton, the way people were given the opportunity to express that and were respected. As you went through the week, you saw every part of the economy represented, from manufacturers and small businesses and generals representing our military, and police officers, firefighters, people who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, parents who've lost young people who gave their lives for our country. We saw every part of America. It was really extraordinary, and I left with such a feeling of hope about the future. And not that there's not a lot of hard work to do, because of course there is, but with a lot of optimism about the fact that if we really work together and respect each other, that we will continue to be the greatest country in the world.
When you looked at that arena, Democrats, by the nature of their process, have many more people that are involved in the actual convention part. And you certainly did have the passion from the Sanders people, but you also had Senator Sanders himself, who was the one who called for acclamation for Secretary Clinton. You had Senator Sanders even on the final day of the convention speaking to the delegation, the Michigan delegation. He made a point to get around to all of the delegations and states where he had won, and others. So Did that help bring folks back together? Understanding that there are going to be some people that are always going to be disappointed that their candidate didn't win. I mean, it's split 17 ways on the Republican side because there are people over there that are unhappy their candidate didn't win too.
Sure. It definitely is what made the difference. I mean, both what Bernie's attitude was as well as Hillary and everybody working together. And I think what we all realize is we have the same goals. We have different ideas about how to get there. So we all know the cost of college are too high and we want debt-free college. And we had two candidates with different ideas, but the same goal. We all know that we have to make sure that healthcare is affordable and available for everyone. With different ideas on how to get there. How do we make sure we've got American jobs? We're closing loopholes overseas, bringing jobs home. So that we all are going the same direction, as opposed to the other side that wants to turn Medicare into a voucher and cut Medicaid and do away with health care for 20 million people. Or Donald Trump, who would say, well, let the banks charge whatever they want for student loans. So very different view between the Republican nominee and the Democratic nominee. And what we have is just a difference in ideas about how to get there.
I would think everybody watching this program would agree that there are great differences in the fundamental approach from what we saw the Republicans lay out in Cleveland and Democrats lay out in Philadelphia. But there is also something that I find very strange about this election cycle, and that is, if you look at polls, and I get it, polling isn't exact, and polling is not the end all, by the way.
Right.
But consistently, both of these candidates, Donald Trump higher than Secretary Clinton, have negatives higher than their approval ratings. And there is something incongruent about a nation of 300 million people nominating two people to the major party candidacies for president that they don't like. But it seems that there's at least some of that going on. What's at play here?
Well, you know, first of all, I have to say that there's an awful lot of us that really like and respect Hillary Clinton and are supporting her, not just voting against.
I didn't suggest it was Democrats. I meant overall.
I know. But I would say that for Hillary, she's had 30 years of standing up against a lot of powerful forces, and the way they've come at her, you know, there's been a lot of negative things for 30 years, and that really wears on you. You know, I can remember when she was fighting for health care and that didn't happen. She got knocked down, got back up and said, okay, how about just covering children? Well, there were a lot of people still didn't like that. And what is this uppity woman who's got her own opinion? She's only a first lady. How does she have the audacity to go in and fight in health care for children? I mean, there's a lot of that kind of thing. We shouldn't trust her because she's got her own opinions. She's strong, she's ambitious. There's something wrong with that if you're a woman. And so she's confronted that for years and years and years. I was in Beijing when the State Department basically didn't want her to make that speech, and certainly the Chinese didn't want her to make that speech when they have a one-child policy, that women's rights are human rights. And so, you know, I have seen her, because of what she believes in, who she is, for 30 years have folks coming at her. I think Donald Trump is a totally different situation here. I mean, he brought on himself because of everything that he's said about people and his disrespect in his business practices and so on. But I would say that this is a very strange election, very interesting election when you look at all of it. And I believe, though, that the more people see about Hillary's knowledge and competency and who she's fighting for and what she believes in, certainly in Michigan. I mean, she's all about manufacturing and small business, and she knows where the Great Lakes are, and she knows what Asian carp is, and she, you know, has been fighting with us to protect the Great Lakes forever. And so I think the more people see who she is, the more support she's going to get.
Talk about that. It's an interesting concept because presidential candidates visiting a state have an interesting impact on the down ballot races. And here in the state, of course, the biggest races out there, maybe a couple of congressional races, but the biggest races, state house races, 110 of those out there. But in fairness, there are not a lot of those that are terribly competitive. I mean, there are some of them that we always keep our eye on. But all of that aside, if you look at the numbers, and again, polling is a snapshot of a moment in time. I don't pretend that any of these hold. But if you look at the swing states, if you start with Florida and Georgia and North Carolina, and Virginia and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan, and you come up there, in almost all cases, Secretary Clinton has an advantage at this moment in time. Now, they're not done. It's not over. We don't vote for a while, but that's the way it's trending. So how much if all of those states are marginally in play, and some of those have a lot bigger electoral totals, Florida, to be sure.
Right.
How much time does she spend here, do you think?
Well, I know she'll be back. I mean, she's been here, and her vice presidential candidate, Tim Kaine, has been here in Grand Rapids, and who, by the way, I think is terrific. He's a great friend of mine, and I think he was a wonderful selection. So she definitely comes back and spends time here, but it is a big country, and there's a lot of states, including some that you didn't even mention that she wants to be in. So,
well, Iowa, for example,
right.
I mean, Iowa's one of those states
Exactly.
where it's probably closer than most people would believe it would be.
Right. In North Carolina, and we're seeing new possibilities. So she definitely will be back, but certainly she's got to make other choices as well.
When you think about the impact of this presidential election, I have pointed out before that political reporters are prone to say this is the most important election because every 4 years we think it's the most important election. It doesn't mean that they aren't important, and it doesn't mean that perhaps sometimes we get a little excited about an election cycle that may not be the momentous change that we think. But in the case of Hillary Clinton, the first ever female nominee for a major party, a former Secretary of State, former United States Senator, Donald Trump, completely unique candidate in and of himself and his background, where we are in history. If I have calculated this right, just once since Franklin Roosevelt has the same party maintained power for 3 terms, because we have gone through this cyclical thing largely since then. How important is this as an election cycle?
Well, I think it is incredibly important, and I always joke that the most important elections for me are when I'm on the ballot, and I'm not on the ballot. So, but I think this is important in 2 kinds of ways. I mean, I think what this says about our country and really believing in a democracy when half the population who's never had someone be president of the United States could have that happen is pretty exciting for my daughter, my granddaughter, boys and girls being able to really see they can be whatever they want to be with the first woman president. What is especially exciting for me is that she's eminently qualified. I would argue that she's probably the most qualified person to ever run for president in terms of having seen how the federal government operates from every single angle and participated in knowing world leaders and having information and skills and so on. But I think it's important in a different way as well, Rick, and that is, this is really a decision about who we are as a country. It's not just a slogan to say, are we about walls versus bridges? Are we about supporting a candidate who says he can do everything all by himself, he knows more about terrorism than the generals, it's all about him? Or are we going to be accepting the fact that we are stronger when we're together and we have the talents of everybody, where we're all pulling in the same direction and respecting the thoughts and ideas of other people? I think that's what our Constitution was based on and our country was based on. And so we have a fundamental decision to make. And when Donald Trump says, he wants to go back, I'm not sure how far back he wants to go in terms of, who was able to participate in the government or the country that he sees as being the country. But I think we want to go forward and we want to respect everyone and we want to make sure we're safe and that we have laws that work, and certainly immigration laws that work, and economic rules that work, and jobs in this country, and a strong education system. But it needs to work for everybody, not just a few.
We'll have more when we come back next to The Point. As we continue our reset, if you will, as we head into the campaign season that goes into the final stretch unofficially on Labor Day, we have 2 more guests that will talk about their take on the campaign. The chairman of the Michigan Democratic Party, Brandon Dillon, and Republican Attorney General Bill Schuette are my guests when you join us next Sunday morning at 10 o'clock right here on Wood TV 8 for To The Point.